The helicopter's rotors cut through the quiet of the Canadian wilderness as I pressed my face against the window, watching endless stretches of pine and spruce roll beneath us. 6 hours ago, I'd been in my lab at the CDC, looking at tissue samples from a routine outbreak investigation. Now, I was flying toward what the government contact had called an unprecedented biological threat in the remote reaches of northern Ontario. My stomach twisted as I went through the classified briefing materials for the third time. 12 victims over 6 weeks, all found in the Greenstone Belt region, spread across campsites and hiking trails that should have been safe. The photographs made my hands shake. Bodies torn apart with surgical precision, flesh stripped away in precise patterns that suggested something far more calculated than a typical animal attack. The pilot's voice came through my headset. 5 minutes out, Dr. Thompson. I nodded, though he couldn't see me from his position. Below us, Lake Superior spread toward the horizon like a dark mirror, its shoreline jagged with old rock formations that had been there for millions of years. Somewhere in those rocks, the thing responsible for the attacks had been hiding. My phone buzzed with a final message from my supervisor. Remember, complete discretion. This doesn't exist until we understand what we're dealing with. The helicopter banked sharply, and I caught my first look at the research site. A collection of military-style tents and mobile command units had been set up in a clearing roughly 2 miles from the lake. Vehicles with government plates formed a circle around the camp, and personnel in tactical gear moved between structures with the quick urgency of people working against a deadline. We touched down on a makeshift landing pad, and I grabbed my equipment cases before the rotors had fully stopped spinning. The October air bit through my jacket immediately. Winter came early this far north, and the temperature had to be near freezing. A man in a dark suit approached as I stepped away from the helicopter. Agent Robert Walker, according to my briefing. His crew cut, and the way he carried himself said military background, and the sidearm on his hip made it clear this wasn't just a scientific expedition. Dr. Thompson, he said, extending a firm handshake. Glad you could make it. We've got a situation that requires your expertise. I followed him toward the largest command tent, noticing the electromagnetic field generators positioned around the perimeter. Whatever they'd found, they were taking serious precautions to contain it. Inside the tent, maps covered every available surface. Red pins marked attack sites, forming a rough circle around Lake Superior's northern shore. A timeline on one wall tracked the progression of incidents, showing how the attacks had grown more frequent and more brutal over the past month. 6 weeks ago, we had our first incident, Walker said, pointing to a pin near Thunder Bay. A couple of hikers found torn apart near their campsite. Local authorities assumed it was a bear attack, maybe a pack of wolves. But the feeding patterns were wrong. He handed me a folder of crime scene photos. I'd seen plenty of animal attacks in my career, but these images made me pause. The bite marks were too large, too precise. The bones showed scoring that suggested something with both the intelligence to target specific areas of the body and the physical capability to tear through human tissue like paper. The attacks escalated quickly, Walker continued. Different locations, but always the same signature. Partial consumption, specific target areas. And then we started finding the other evidence. He took me to a table where plaster casts sat under protective covers. I lifted the first one and my breath caught. The footprint was huge, easily 18 inches long and showing clear toe marks that ended in what looked like claw marks. But the basic shape was humanoid, not animal. These were found at multiple sites, Walker said, along with claw marks on trees, always about 8 to 10 feet off the ground. Whatever made these tracks was walking upright and had significant reach. I set down the cast and picked up another piece of evidence, bark samples showing deep gouges. The marks were too uniform to be random scratching. They looked almost territorial, like the creature was marking its hunting grounds. Did you consult with local authorities? I asked. The indigenous communities in this area might have historical knowledge that could help. Walker's expression got more serious. We reached out to the Ojibwe bands in the region. Most were reluctant to talk, but one elder mentioned something called a Wendigo, said it was connected to cannibalism and endless hunger. The word sent an unexpected chill through me. I'd come across references to Wendigo folklore during my research into ritualistic consumption patterns in isolated communities, but I'd always thought of it as cultural mythology rather than biological reality. 3 days ago, we got our break, Walker continued. Thermal imaging from aerial surveillance picked up movement in a cave system about 15 miles northeast of here. The heat signature was massive, much larger than any known predator in this region. He showed me satellite images of the cave entrance, a dark opening in a cliff face overlooking Lake Superior. The surrounding area showed clear signs of disturbance: broken vegetation, scattered animal bones, and what looked like crude nesting materials. We moved in yesterday at dawn, Walker said. Full tactical team with specialized equipment. The thing was deep in the cave system, and when we found it... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. It wasn't what we expected. He led me to another section of the tent where video monitors showed feeds from helmet cameras. The footage was grainy and chaotic, but I could make out the cave interior as tactical lights swept across very old rock formations. Then the cameras focused on a figure hunched in the deepest chamber. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. The creature was unmistakably humanoid, but wrong in every proportion. Nearly 9 feet tall even in its crouched position, with arms that hung well past where its knees should be. Its frame was emaciated to the point where individual ribs showed clearly through grayish skin, yet there was obvious strength in the way it moved. It didn't run when we approached, Walker said, just watched us with these yellowish eyes that seemed to track our every movement, almost like it was studying us rather than reacting in fear. The video showed the team deploying their electromagnetic nets, specialized equipment designed for containing unknown biological threats. The creature allowed itself to be restrained with minimal resistance, though the footage captured glimpses of elongated fingers ending in what looked like natural claws, and a mouth filled with yellowed fangs that were definitely not human. High-powered tranquilizers brought it down eventually, Walker continued. But even sedated, there was something unsettling about the way it looked at us, like it knew something we didn't. The final piece of footage showed the creature being loaded onto a specialized transport vehicle. Even unconscious, its presence seemed to affect the equipment. Electronic devices flickered, and several team members reported feeling disoriented during the loading process. "Where is it now?" I asked. "Being transported to a classified facility about 3 hours south of here. Underground research complex designed for studying unknown biological threats. That's where you come in, Dr. Thompson. We need someone with your background to analyze what we're dealing with." I studied the evidence again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing with anything I knew about biology. The creature's body suggested severe malnutrition, yet it had clearly been able to overpower healthy adult humans. The bite patterns showed dental structures unlike any known mammalian predator. "Has anyone examined tissue samples yet?" I asked. "We collected some hair and skin cells during transport," Walker said. "Preliminary analysis shows cellular structures that don't match any existing taxonomy. There's also evidence of some kind of pathogen or parasite, but our field equipment isn't sophisticated enough for detailed study." My phone buzzed with a message about my lab equipment being loaded onto a truck for transport to the facility. Whatever this thing was, I'd be working with it directly within hours. "One more thing," Walker said as we prepared to leave the command tent. "During transport, the sedatives started wearing off about halfway to the facility. The creature didn't become violent or try to escape. Instead, it started making sounds." "What kind of sounds?" "Whispers, in a language none of our linguists recognized. The transport team said it felt like the thing was trying to communicate, but the words..." He shook his head. "They said listening to it made them feel sick, like the sounds were wrong somehow." I gathered my equipment and followed Walker to the waiting vehicles. As we drove away from the research site, I watched the wilderness roll past and tried to prepare myself for what I'd encounter at the facility. In my 15 years studying parasitic organisms and biological threats, I'd seen plenty of cases that challenged conventional understanding. But something about this situation felt different. The drive took us through increasingly remote terrain, past abandoned mining operations and forests that seemed too quiet for October. Eventually, we turned onto an unmarked access road that led to what looked like a standard industrial complex from the outside. Only the unusual density of security checkpoints and electromagnetic field generators gave away its true purpose. The creature had arrived an hour before us, according to the facility director who met us at the entrance. Dr. James Adams had the bearing of someone used to command, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of rigid posture that suggested military background. He led us through multiple security checkpoints and down into the underground levels where the real work took place. "Containment Cell 7, he said as we walked through corridors lined with reinforced steel, specifically designed for unknown biological threats, titanium-reinforced walls, electromagnetic field generators, and complete atmospheric control." We stopped at an observation window that looked into a sterile white chamber. The creature sat in the far corner, no longer restrained but clearly aware of its surroundings. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, its features were even more unsettling than they had appeared in the cave footage. Its skin had a grayish pallor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The elongated limbs were even more pronounced now that it was sitting upright, and I could see the way its fingers ended in what were definitely claws rather than fingernails. But it was the eyes that made me step back from the window. Yellowish and clearly intelligent, tracking our movements with an awareness that felt deeply wrong. "It's been conscious for about 20 minutes, Dr. Adams said. "No attempts to escape or show aggression, just watching." As if responding to our conversation, the creature slowly turned its head toward the observation window. Even through the reinforced glass, its stare felt sharp, like it was looking directly at me rather than just in my general direction. Then it opened its mouth and began to whisper. The sound was barely heard through the containment system's speakers, but I could hear the rhythm of language even if the words were impossible to understand. The whispers seemed to bypass normal hearing somehow, creating a feeling that was more felt than heard. "Has it done this before?" I asked, fighting the urge to cover my ears. "Only during transport," Dr. Adams replied. "The research team is waiting for you in Lab 3. Dr. Richards, our behavioral psychologist, has been documenting its responses to various stimuli." I followed him away from the containment area, but I could feel those yellow eyes watching me until we turned the corner. Whatever this creature was, it had already taken specific notice of me, and somehow I got the feeling that was exactly what it wanted. I adjusted the microscope's focus for the third time, watching the blood cells move under magnification like they were trying to escape the slide. 3 days of lab work had given me a routine here in the underground facility, but what I was seeing through the lens went against every principle of cellular biology I'd learned in 15 years of research. Dr. Adams had called the morning briefing for 7 sharp, gathering the core research team in conference room B. The facility director carried himself like a military commander even in his lab coat, laying out our objectives with the kind of precision that suggested this project had backing at the highest levels of government. "Our primary goals are threefold," he'd said, clicking through slides on the presentation screen. "First, determine the creature's complete biological composition and cellular structure. Second, document its feeding patterns and metabolic requirements. Third, assess any potential applications for military or defense purposes." Agent Walker had nodded from his spot near the door, always placing himself where he could watch both the room and any exits. His constant presence reminded us that this wasn't just scientific research. We were dealing with something the government considered a potential weapon. Dr. Richards had taken notes throughout the briefing, occasionally glancing up with the kind of thoughtful expression that meant he was already forming behavioral theories. The psychologist seemed methodical but approachable, someone who'd spend hours documenting small details others might miss. The subject has been in containment for 72 hours, Adams had continued. No signs of distress or attempts to escape. Refuses all food offerings, including fresh meat samples that should trigger feeding responses in any predatory species. That detail bothered me more than it should have. Most captured animals showed clear stress signs, pacing, making noise, marking territory. This creature just sat in its corner, watching. Now, hunched over my workstation in Lab 3, I studied the blood samples we'd collected during the initial medical examination. The pathogen Dr. Adams had mentioned was unlike anything in existing literature. Under standard magnification, the infected cells looked normal. But when I increased the power and added specific staining protocols, the cellular walls showed evidence of systematic rewriting. The DNA strands weren't just damaged, they were being rebuilt according to some pattern I couldn't identify. The rate of change was extraordinary, with cellular division happening at roughly 3 times normal speed. Yet instead of creating cancerous growths, the changes seemed purposeful, like something was directing the transformation from within. I made notes on the sample analysis, documenting the temperature changes and electromagnetic readings that accompanied each cellular change. Whatever this pathogen was, it operated on principles that challenged everything we understood about biological infection. A soft knock interrupted my work. Dr. Richards stood in the doorway, tablet in hand, and that constantly thoughtful expression on his face. "Mind if I join you? I've been reviewing the behavioral observations and wanted to cross-reference with your biological findings." I pointed to the chair across from my workstation. "The cellular analysis is interesting and disturbing. What have you noticed about how it acts?" Richards pulled up video footage on his tablet, showing multiple angles of the containment cell. "It's showing amazing environmental awareness. See how it puts itself to watch the maximum area? That's not random placement. It's strategic." The video showed the creature in its typical corner position, but Richards was right. From that angle, it could see both the main observation window and the secondary monitoring station, plus the cell's entrance. The positioning was calculated. "There's something else," Richards continued, flipping to another video file. "Watch its eye movement patterns when different personnel enter the observation area." I studied the footage as various staff members approached the containment window. With most people, the creature's look tracked their movement casually, almost without interest. But when certain individuals appeared, its attention became laser-focused, following every gesture with an intensity that felt predatory. "It's evaluating people," I said, noting how the creature's posture shifted slightly when specific personnel appeared. "But based on what criteria?" "That's what concerns me. It's not random selection. There's a pattern, but I can't identify the determining factors yet." Richards showed me additional footage of the feeding attempts. Multiple times per day, staff members had offered various food sources through the cell's feeding slot. Raw meat, processed foods, even live prey animals had been presented. The creature noticed each offering but never approached or showed interest. 48 hours without eating anything, Richards noted. Most mammals would show significant distress by now, but its vital signs remain stable. Whatever metabolic processes keep it functioning, they don't follow normal biological rules. I thought about the cellular analysis and the accelerated DNA reconstruction I'd observed. Maybe it doesn't need conventional nutrition. If it can rewrite cellular structures at the molecular level, it might be able to sustain itself through different mechanisms. Or it's waiting for something specific, Richards said quietly. The comment sent an unexpected chill through me. The idea that this creature might be showing patience rather than hunger meant it could plan ahead, which made our containment procedures feel suddenly not good enough. Dr. Adams's voice came over the intercom, asking me to report to Observation Station Alpha for direct behavioral documentation. I gathered my notes and headed down the corridor, passing the electromagnetic field generators that buzzed constantly along the walls. The facility felt different after 3 days. Not more familiar, but somehow more oppressive, like the creature's presence was affecting the entire environment. Observation Station Alpha provided the clearest view into the containment cell through reinforced glass barriers. The creature sat in its usual corner, but as soon as I approached the window, its posture changed. It lifted its head slowly, those yellowish eyes fixing on me with an intensity that made me step back without thinking. For several seconds, we just looked at each other through the glass. I tried to maintain scientific objectivity, documenting its facial structure and eye movement patterns. The long features were clearly humanoid, but wrong in every proportion. Then it moved. The creature rose from its seated position with smooth grace that didn't match its skinny appearance. It crossed the cell in 3 long steps and pressed its face directly against the glass barrier, less than 2 feet from where I stood. Its eyes never left mine. This close, I could see the yellow irises contained flecks of other colors, deep brown, amber, even traces of green that reminded me uncomfortably of my own eye color. The creature's breath fogged the glass slightly, and I noticed its mouth was slightly open, revealing those yellowed fangs that looked designed for tearing rather than chewing. I forced myself to take notes, documenting the encounter even as every instinct screamed at me to back away. The creature's stare felt like it could see right through me in a way that had nothing to do with its physical closeness. It was like being examined by something that understood far more about me than I understood about it. The staring continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Neither of us moved. I found myself studying the creature's features, noting the way its long fingers pressed against the glass, and how its breathing seemed deliberately controlled rather than automatic. Then, as suddenly as it had approached, the creature stepped back. It returned to its corner with the same smooth movement, settling into its usual position and going back to the catatonic posture it had maintained for 3 days. But its eyes remained fixed on me until I finally left the observation station. I spent the rest of the day analyzing tissue samples and reviewing video footage, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had changed during that encounter. The creature's behavior had been purposeful, targeted. It had specifically chosen to interact with me, rather than just watch. Richards found me in the lab around 6 that evening, still staring at cellular analysis results. "How did the observation session go?" he asked. "It approached the barrier," I said, not looking up from my notes. "Direct eye contact for several minutes, then returned to its passive state." "Interesting. That's the first time it's shown active interest in any staff member." I finally met his eyes. "What do you think that means?" Richards thought about this carefully. "Either it's starting to get used to us being here, or it's found something specific about you that it wants to look at more closely." Neither possibility felt good. That night, back in my temporary room on the facility's residential level, I tried to process everything I'd seen. The biological analysis suggested a pathogen unlike anything in known taxonomy. The behavioral patterns showed intelligence and strategic thinking, and the direct encounter had left me with the disturbing impression that I was being studied just as hard as I was studying it. I fell asleep reviewing my notes, but my dreams took me far from the sterile facility corridors. I found myself standing in an endless winter landscape, snow stretching to the horizon, under a gray sky that held no sun. The cold cut through my clothes like it was alive, and somewhere in the distance I could hear screaming carried on a wind that never seemed to stop. In the dream, I wasn't alone. People moved through the snow around me, but when I tried to focus on them, they became unclear shadows that stayed just at the edge of my vision. The screaming grew louder, more desperate, and I realized it wasn't coming from the distant figures. It was coming from me. I woke up gasping, the facility's ventilation system making a quiet noise in the background. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and for a few confusing seconds I could still feel the dream's cold burning my skin. I checked the clock, 3:17 a.m. I'd been asleep for less than 4 hours, but going back to sleep felt impossible. Instead, I sat up and reviewed my notes again, trying to focus on concrete data rather than the leftover images from the nightmare. But even in the normal routine of scientific analysis, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had changed completely. The creature's direct attention during the observation session felt like a turning point, though toward what, I couldn't say. All I knew was that tomorrow, I'd have to face those yellow eyes again, and the thought filled me with a worry I couldn't entirely explain. I rubbed my eyes and checked the lab chronometer again. 3 hours of sleep in the past 2 days wasn't sustainable, but every time I closed my eyes, that winter landscape crept back into my dreams. The coffee maker in Lab 3 had become my closest companion, brewing another pot as I reviewed cellular analysis data that refused to make sense. 1 week into the research project, and the creature's biological composition still went against every principle I understood. The pathogen samples showed accelerated mutation rates that should have killed the host organism within hours, yet somehow maintained perfect cellular cohesion. I'd run the same tests dozens of times, hoping for different results that never came. My workstation displayed microscopic images of tissue samples that looked like nothing in existing taxonomic records. The DNA strands rebuilt themselves in real time under observation, following patterns that suggested purpose rather than random genetic damage. I made notes about the electromagnetic fluctuations that accompanied each cellular change, documenting readings that grew stronger with each passing day. The facility felt different after a week of constant exposure to the creature's presence. Staff members moved through corridors with less casual conversation, and several people had requested transfers to other projects. Dr. Adams attributed the mood change to working in an underground environment, but I suspected something more fundamental was affecting everyone here. I gathered my observation notes and headed toward Containment Station Alpha for the morning documentation session. The corridor buzzed with electromagnetic field generators that ran continuously now, their frequency adjusted after yesterday's power fluctuations. Whatever was generating those disturbances, the engineering team couldn't isolate the source. The creature sat in its usual corner position when I approached the observation window, but its posture seemed more alert than during previous sessions. Those yellowish eyes tracked my movement as I set up the recording equipment and opened my documentation tablet. Subject appears responsive to human presence, I spoke into the voice recorder. Day 7 of containment, no signs of physical deterioration. Vital signs remain stable despite continued refusal of all food offerings. I adjusted the observation camera angle to capture the creature's full shape. Even seated, its long proportions were disturbing. Arms that hung past its knees, fingers that ended in clearly defined claws, and that skinny frame that somehow showed strength rather than weakness. The creature lifted its head and looked directly at the observation window. Not in my general direction, but exactly at where I stood behind the reinforced glass. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing those yellowed fangs. And then it spoke. Dr. Sarah Thompson. The voice reached me like a raspy whisper that had nothing to do with the intercom system. The speakers stayed silent, but the words formed clearly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. I stepped back from the window, my tablet almost slipping as my hands started shaking. You hear me now, the creature continued, its mental voice carrying an ancient quality that made my skin crawl. Good. We have much to discuss. I forced myself to maintain documentation protocol, even as my heart rate spiked. Subject appears to be attempting vocalization. No sound detected through monitoring equipment. Your machines cannot record what passes between us, the creature said, and I could see its mouth moving slightly with each word that formed in my thoughts. This conversation exists beyond their crude technology. My hands shook as I wrote notes about the apparent communication attempt. The creature's stare never wavered, and the mental voice continued with disturbing clarity. I have walked this earth for millennia, Dr. Thompson. Long before your civilization built its first cities, I was feeding on human flesh and spreading my gift to those worthy of transformation. I documented the creature's behavioral change while fighting the urge to flee the observation station. The voice in my head felt invasive, like something had crawled inside my thoughts and taken residence there. "The process begins with consumption," it explained, and I could hear satisfaction in the mental tone. "A single bite of my flesh will start the change. The victim's mind becomes clearer, sharper, while their body adapts to new hungers. Eventually they become what I am, eternal, powerful, free from the weakness of ordinary mortality." The creature moved, coming closer to the glass barrier. "You want to understand my biology, but you're studying the wrong thing. This form is merely a vessel. The true nature of what I am exists in the spaces between thought and flesh." I tried to focus on scientific observation, but the voice made concentration nearly impossible. "Subject shows increased activity. Positioning suggests attempted communication. Your failed marriage haunts you," the creature said suddenly, and ice flooded my veins. "David's infidelity broke something inside you that never properly healed. You blame yourself for not seeing the signs earlier." I hadn't mentioned my divorce to anyone at the facility. That information wasn't in any personnel files accessible here. "And your sister Emma," it continued, apparently reading my shocked expression. "You haven't spoken to her in 3 years, not since she chose David's side during the separation. The betrayal cut deeper than your husband's affairs because you expected it from him, but never from her." My pen had stopped moving entirely. The creature's knowledge of personal details I'd never shared with colleagues felt like a violation that went beyond physical space. "You still have nightmares about the basement in your childhood home," it whispered into my thoughts. "The darkness that seemed to move when you were 7 years old. Your parents said it was imagination, but you knew something waited down there in the shadows." The memory hit me like a physical blow, standing at the top of basement stairs in the house where I grew up, convinced that something inhuman was watching me from the darkness below. I'd never told anyone about those childhood fears, not even David during our most intimate conversations. "How do you know these things?" I whispered, forgetting for a moment that I was supposed to be conducting scientific observation. "I know because I am patient," the creature replied, moving until its face pressed against the glass barrier. "I have had a week to explore your mind during our sessions. Each time you observe me, I observe you in return." I backed away from the window, but the mental voice followed me with perfect clarity. "Your research will serve my purposes beautifully, Dr. Thompson. The government's desire to weaponize my abilities will become the instrument of their destruction. They seek to create controlled monsters, but they will only succeed in spreading my gift beyond these walls." The observation session had lasted 20 minutes longer than scheduled, but I couldn't bring myself to leave while the creature continued speaking directly into my thoughts. Its knowledge of my personal history felt like hooks in my mind, pulling me toward the glass barrier even as rational thought screamed at me to run. "Sleep has become difficult for you," it noted accurately. "Food holds little appeal. These are early signs of our connection strengthening. Soon you will understand why I chose you specifically for this work." I forced myself to gather my equipment and documentation materials. The creature watched me prepare to leave with what looked like amusement. "Until tomorrow, Dr. Thompson. We have so much more to discuss." The mental voice faded as I walked away from the observation station, but I could feel those yellow eyes tracking my movement until I rounded the corner. My hands were still shaking when I reached Lab 3, and the coffee I'd been wanting moments earlier now smelled sick. Dr. Richards found me staring at my notes an hour later, trying to process what had happened during the observation session. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my workstation. "You look like you haven't slept in days." "Work stress," I replied automatically, though the explanation felt inadequate. "The cellular analysis is more complex than we initially anticipated." Richard studied my face with the careful attention of someone trained to read behavioral cues. "Have you been eating regularly? You've lost weight since starting this project." I looked down at my lab coat, realizing he was right. The sleeves hung looser than they had a week ago, and my pants felt baggy around the waist. When had I last eaten a full meal? The facility cafeteria had started seeming less appealing each day, with even basic foods triggering mild nausea. "I've been focused on the research," I said. "Sometimes I forget meal schedules." "That's concerning, Sarah. This project is demanding enough without compromising your physical health. Maybe you should consider taking a day off to recover." The suggestion triggered an unexpected wave of anxiety. The idea of being away from the facility, of missing observation sessions with the creature, felt wrong somehow, like leaving important work that only I could finish. "The biological analysis is at a critical stage," I said. "Agent Walker has been pressing for faster results, and Dr. Adams wants comprehensive reports by the end of the week." Richards looked unhappy. "Walker's been pushing everyone hard lately. He seems more upset than when we started. Yesterday, he demanded access to tissue samples for his own analysis, even though he has no background in cellular biology." That was news to me. Walker hadn't mentioned wanting direct access to biological materials during our briefings. His focus had always been on practical applications rather than scientific understanding. What did Dr. Adams tell him? "That all sample analysis goes through you first." Walker wasn't happy about the delay, but Adams held firm on protocol. I thought about the creature's promise that my research would serve its purposes, and a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the facility's air conditioning. "Dr. Thompson," Agent Walker's voice came through the lab intercom. "Report to Conference Room B for briefing update." Richards and I looked at each other. Scheduled briefings were supposed to happen every 3 days, and we'd had one yesterday. I grabbed my files and walked toward the conference room, going through hallways that felt more crushing than they had a week ago. The electromagnetic field generators buzzed at a slightly different frequency, and several staff members I passed looked as tired as I felt. Agent Walker was waiting with Dr. Adams when I arrived. Both men looked upset, and Walker's usually neat posture seemed more stiff than normal. "Dr. Thompson," Walker said without preamble, "I need you to accelerate your biological analysis. We're under pressure from Washington to provide actionable intelligence about this creature's capabilities." "The cellular analysis is proceeding as quickly as possible," I replied. "The organism's structure is unlike anything in existing taxonomy. Proper documentation requires—" "What it requires is faster results," Walker interrupted. "We have other facilities standing by to begin parallel research, but they need your preliminary findings to establish their own protocols." The mention of other facilities made me think about the creature's warnings, and I felt that invasive mental voice whispering at the edges of my thoughts. "Rushing the analysis could compromise accuracy," I said. "Some of the cellular changes I've observed take hours to complete their cycles. If we interrupt the process, then find a way to speed it up," Walker said sharply. "This project has national security implications that go beyond academic thoroughness." Dr. Adams cleared his throat diplomatically. "Agent Walker, Dr. Thompson's expertise is why she was brought onto this project. Perhaps we should trust her judgment about appropriate research timelines." Walker's expression tightened, and I noticed his hands had clenched into fists. "My orders come from levels above this facility, Dr. Adams. The Department of Defense wants operational assessments, not theoretical documentation." Something about Walker's behavior seemed different from the controlled professionalism he'd shown during our first week. His movements looked more aggressive, and there was an intensity in his eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of the creature's stare. "I'll review the analysis protocols," I said carefully. "There might be ways to streamline the documentation process without compromising scientific accuracy." "Good," Walker replied, but his tone suggested the concession wasn't enough. "I want preliminary reports on weaponization potential by Thursday. The other research sites are waiting for your data to begin their own studies." After the briefing, I returned to Lab 3 with a growing sense of worry. The creature's promise that my research would serve its purposes felt more threatening in light of Walker's pressure for faster results. If tissue samples were being passed around to other facilities, Any contamination or infection could spread far beyond our controlled environment. I spent the afternoon reviewing cellular analysis data, but concentration remained difficult. The creature's mental voice seemed to hover at the edge of my thoughts, occasionally whispering comments that made my skin crawl. Even when I couldn't hear specific words, I felt its presence like a constant background buzz that made normal thought processes sluggish. By evening, the idea of returning to my quarters felt less appealing than staying in the lab. The residential level's silence made the creature's mental voice seem louder, more intrusive. At least the lab's equipment provided white noise that helped mask the whispers. I made another pot of coffee and settled in for another long night of analysis, trying to ignore the growing certainty that something fundamental had changed during that morning's observation session. The creature had established direct contact, and somehow I knew tomorrow's session would take our connection even deeper. Outside the lab windows, the Canadian wilderness stretched endlessly into darkness, but I found myself thinking less about the world beyond the facility and more about the yellow eyes that watched me from behind reinforced glass. 2 weeks of not getting enough sleep, and the creature's constant mental whispers had left me operating on autopilot, moving through research work with mechanical precision while my mind struggled to process what I was documenting. The cellular analysis data had grown more disturbing each day, showing faster mutation rates that went against every principle of biological science I understood. I'd been staying in Lab 3 most nights now, finding the residential quarters too quiet and somehow threatening. The lab's equipment buzz provided enough background noise to partially mask the creature's voice, though it never disappeared entirely. Sometimes I caught myself responding to comments it made about my work, forgetting that no one else could hear our conversations. The facility had gotten tense over the past week. Staff members moved through corridors with visible stress. Several had requested transfers, and the cafeteria stayed mostly empty during meal periods. Dr. Adams blamed the mood on extended underground assignment stress, but I suspected our closeness to the creature was affecting everyone in ways we didn't fully understand. Agent Walker's pressure for faster results had intensified daily. He got more aggressive with each briefing, and I'd noticed him avoiding the containment area entirely, conducting meetings exclusively in Conference Room B on the facility's upper level. The change in his behavior suggested the creature's influence might extend further than we realized. I was reviewing tissue mutation data when footsteps carried from the corridor outside Lab 3. The sound was wrong somehow, too heavy, with an irregular rhythm that didn't match normal human movement. I checked the wall clock, 3:17 a.m. No staff members should be moving through this section at this hour without prior authorization. The footsteps stopped directly outside the lab entrance. I saved my work and moved quietly toward the door, listening for additional sounds that might indicate the person's intentions. The facility's emergency protocols required all after-hours movement to be logged with security, but the corridor stayed silent, except for the steady buzz of electromagnetic field generators. I opened the lab door carefully and looked down the hallway toward the storage areas where we kept biological samples. A light was on in Storage Lab B, casting harsh fluorescent light into the corridor. That room housed the creature's tissue samples, materials that required special handling protocols and authorized access. Moving quietly down the hallway, I approached the storage lab entrance and peered through the partially open door. Dr. Richards stood with his back to me, hunched over the sample preparation counter. He looked wrong somehow, shoulders too rigid and head tilted at an unnatural angle. His lab coat hung loosely on what appeared to be a much thinner frame than I remembered. "Mike," I called softly, "what are you doing here this late?" He didn't respond or turn around. I could hear wet, tearing sounds coming from his direction, like someone handling raw meat without proper tools. The smell hit me next, metallic and organic, with an underlying scent of decay that made my stomach clench. I stepped into the storage lab and moved around the counter to see what he was working on. Dr. Richards crouched over an open tissue sample container, his hands bloody to the wrists. Between his fingers hung strips of raw flesh, pieces of the creature's tissue samples that should have been preserved in sterile solution. He was eating them. Richards had the tissue pressed against his mouth, tearing at the material with teeth that looked longer and sharper than they should have been. His fingernails had grown into distinct claws that left gouges in the metal counter surface. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes reflected the lab's fluorescent lighting with an unnatural yellow shine. "Sarah," he said, and his voice carried a raspy quality that reminded me of the creature's mental whispers. "You're working late again." Blood covered his chin and stained the front of his lab coat. The tissue sample container lay empty beside him, its preservative solution spilled across the counter in dark puddles. I realized he'd eaten several samples, materials that contained active pathogen that we'd been handling with full hazmat protocols. "Mike, what have you done?" I backed toward the lab entrance, reaching for the emergency alarm panel. "Those samples are contaminated. You need immediate medical attention." "Contaminated," he repeated, standing slowly. His movements had the same fluid grace I'd observed in the creature, as if his body had adapted to different physical principles. "Is that what you call improvement?" Richards moved between me and the door with surprising speed. Up close, his change was undeniable. His face had become thin and sharp, with skin taking on the grayish color I documented in the creature. His lab coat hung on a body that appeared to have lost weight, yet he moved with obvious strength. "The hunger was unbearable," he explained, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. 3 days without sleep, food tasting like ash, constant whispers promising relief. The samples called to me. I tried to activate the emergency alarm, but Richards grabbed my wrist with inhuman strength. His fingers ended in claws that punctured my lab coat and drew blood from my arm. The touch sent electric pain through my nervous system, and I could swear I heard the creature's laughter repeating in my mind. "Let go of me." I pulled against his grip, but his strength was incredible. The claws dug deeper into my arm, and I could feel warmth spreading from the wounds. "You understand the hunger," Richard said, his yellow eyes fixed on mine. "I can smell it on you. The creature has been preparing you just as it prepared me." I managed to break free and stumbled toward the lab entrance, calling for security assistance. Richards followed with that disturbing fluid movement, his claws clicking against the metal doorframe as he pursued me into the corridor. "Security to Storage Lab B," I shouted into the facility intercom. "Medical emergency in Storage Lab B." Richards laughed, and the sound had the same old quality as the creature's mental voice. "They can't help you understand what we're becoming, Sarah. The change is a gift, not a disease." Footsteps thundered through the hallway as security personnel responded to my call. Richards heard them coming, and his posture changed into something predatory. When the first guard rounded the corner, Richards attacked with speed that went beyond human abilities. The guard had his electric prod ready, but Richards moved too quickly. He tackled the man against the hallway wall with enough force to crack the concrete. The guard's scream was cut short as Richards bit down on his neck with those sharpened teeth, tearing through fabric and flesh with skill that suggested he'd done this before. "Use the electric prods," I shouted to the other guards approaching. "Don't let him bite you." 2 more security guards turned on their stun devices and moved toward Richards carefully. He let go of the first guard, who fell down bleeding badly from his neck wound. Richards hunched over the injured man, blood covering his mouth and hands. The guards worked together, using the prods to push Richards away from his victim. The electrical shock made him jerk and back off, but even beaten down, he kept moving in that smooth way. It took keeping the electricity on him to finally knock him out, and even then, his breathing stayed steady and controlled. "Get medical teams for both of them," I ordered, kneeling beside the injured guard. The bite wound on his neck was severe, but not immediately life-threatening. However, given what I'd observed about infection transmission, any exposure to Richard's saliva was potentially catastrophic. Dr. Adams got there within minutes, still putting on his lab coat over his regular clothes. His face went from worried to horrified as he looked around. Richard's unconscious on the hallway floor, the the injured guard getting emergency medical treatment, and blood splattered across the storage lab entrance. "What happened here?" Adams demanded. Dr. Richards consumed tissue samples from the creature, I reported, maintaining clinical detachment even as my hands shook. Multiple samples over an extended period. The transformation appears to have been rapid and comprehensive. Transformation? Adams studied Richards's unconscious form, noting the elongated features and grayish skin tone. How long has this been developing? Based on his behavioral changes over the past week, possibly since the project began. But the physical alterations have accelerated dramatically in the last few days. Adams turned on his communication device and started giving orders for containment protocols. Within an hour, Richards had been moved to Containment Cell 8, specially set up with the same electromagnetic field generators that held the original creature. The injured guard was put in isolation in the medical wing under full quarantine conditions. I spent the rest of the night documenting the incident and implementing revised safety protocols. The creature's mental voice provided running commentary on events, expressing satisfaction at Richard's transformation and anticipation for what would follow. He consumed my flesh willingly, it whispered into my thoughts as I worked. The hunger I planted in him overcame his scientific training, just as it will with the others I have marked. The implications were huge. If Richards had been influenced to eat the tissue samples, the creature's control went far beyond direct communication. It could manipulate behavior, trigger unstoppable urges, and potentially spread its influence through anyone with long exposure to its presence. Over the following 48 hours, Richards's transformation sped up beyond anything I'd documented in biological literature. His body became increasingly thin and stretched out. His skin turned to the same grayish color as the original creature, and his movements took on that disturbing, smooth grace that suggested adaptation to different physical laws. Most disturbing was his speech. Richards began speaking in the same old language as the creature, carrying on conversations that seemed to involve multiple participants. Video analysis suggested he was responding to communication from the original creature in the next containment cell, even though the electromagnetic barriers should have prevented any interaction. The bitten guard developed symptoms within 12 hours. First came fever and excessive sweating, followed by aggressive behavior toward medical staff. He complained constantly about hunger that couldn't be satisfied by normal food, and his fingernails began showing signs of sped-up growth similar to Richards's transformation. The infection spreads through saliva, blood, or consumption of infected tissue, the creature explained during one of our mental conversations. Each vector produces slightly different transformation timelines, but the result remains consistent. I reported these findings to Dr. Adams, recommending immediate isolation for anyone who had been in extended contact with Richards during the weeks leading up to his consumption of the tissue samples. The recommendation met resistance from Agent Walker, who insisted that staffing limitations made comprehensive quarantine impossible. "We can't isolate half the research team based on theoretical exposure," Walker argued during an emergency briefing. "The project timeline doesn't allow for extended personnel delays." "The transformation we've observed in Dr. Richards represents a complete breakdown of human physiology," I countered. "If this can spread through casual contact or airborne transmission, the entire facility could be compromised." Dr. Adams supported increased security measures but stopped short of facility-wide quarantine. Instead, he ordered enhanced monitoring for all personnel and restricted access to the containment areas. The measures felt inadequate given what I'd witnessed, but facility command structure limited my authority to implement more comprehensive protections. The creature seemed amused by our attempts at containment. "Your colleagues still believe they can control what they don't understand," it whispered during my observation sessions. "They see Richards's transformation as a failure of protocol rather than the first step in a much larger process." "What larger process?" I asked, forgetting that speaking aloud to the creature would be recorded by monitoring equipment. "The spread beyond these walls," it replied with satisfaction. Your research data has already been transmitted to other facilities as part of standard protocols. Military personnel attempting to contain outbreaks at those locations will become carriers themselves, spreading my gift to major population centers. The realization hit me hard. Agent Walker's pressure for faster results, the distribution of tissue samples to other research sites, the government's interest in weaponizing the creature's abilities, all of it was serving the entity's purposes rather than our own. I spent the night reviewing communication logs and research transmission records. The creature was right. Our biological analysis data had been automatically uploaded to Pentagon servers, CDC databases, and parallel research facilities in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Los Angeles. If the pathogen could spread through digital information, or if tissue samples had been distributed for independent analysis, the infection was already beyond our control. The bitten guard's condition got worse rapidly on the third day after exposure. His fever spiked to dangerous levels, his aggressive behavior required physical restraints, and his fingernails had grown into unmistakable claws. Most alarming was his vocal development. He began making the same whispered sounds as Richards in the original creature. Dr. Adams ordered his transfer to a third containment cell, effectively turning the facility into a prison for infected personnel. The quarantine measures meant reduced staffing levels, restricted movement between facility sections, and constant surveillance for signs of additional infections. I found myself wondering how many other staff members might be experiencing the early symptoms I'd noticed in Richards: appetite loss, insomnia, increasing aggression, and the subtle behavioral changes that came before physical transformation. The creature's influence seemed to operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, making early detection nearly impossible. "Your turn approaches," the creature whispered during my final observation session of the day. "The hunger grows stronger in you each day, just as it did in Richards. Soon, you will understand why I chose you specifically for this work." I left the containment area with growing worry, knowing that tomorrow would bring new evidence of the infection's spread and my own increasing vulnerability to the creature's influence. The facility that had felt like a research site 2 weeks ago now looked like an incubation chamber for something humanity wasn't prepared to face. The transformation of Dr. Richards was complete, but it was only the beginning. The 72 hours following Michael's change felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion, each new infection confirming what I'd begun to suspect but hadn't wanted to accept. I'd been documenting cellular change rates and transmission paths, but the reality of an airborne bug spreading through our closed environment hit me hard. 3 more staff members had reported to the medical wing within the past day, all showing the same early symptoms I'd first seen in Michael weeks ago. Lisa from the communications department complained of insomnia and violent dreams. Marcus, one of our security guards, had lost 15 pounds and started avoiding the cafeteria entirely. Dr. Peterson from the analysis lab showed up with scratches on his arms that he claimed came from restless sleep, though the marks looked suspiciously like claw marks. I spent most of those 3 days in Lab 3, running air quality tests and analyzing ventilation samples that confirmed my worst fears. The facility's circulation system had been distributing tiny particles throughout the building, not just standard atmospheric contamination, but active bug carriers that remained alive in the air for hours after initial exposure. The creature's mental voice had grown stronger and more constant during this period, providing running commentary on the infection's progress with obvious satisfaction. "Your colleagues still believe they can contain what they don't understand," it whispered as I reviewed contamination data. "They focus on physical barriers while my influence spreads through every breath they take." I tried to ignore the voice and concentrate on developing some kind of containment solution, but the constant mental intrusion made analytical thinking increasingly difficult. My hands shook as I prepared testing samples, and the lab's fluorescent lighting seemed harsher than it had weeks ago. "The hunger grows in you as well," the creature continued. "I can feel your resistance weakening. Soon you will understand why fighting this transformation only prolongs unnecessary suffering. Dr. Adams called an emergency meeting that morning, gathering the remaining uninfected staff in Conference Room B. His usually calm appearance showed cracks of strain, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been getting as little sleep as the rest of us. Effective immediately, this facility is under emergency lockdown, he announced without preamble. All external communications are suspended, and no personnel will be permitted to leave until we've contained this situation. The room erupted in protests from staff members who had families outside the facility, but Adams raised his hand for silence. "I've sealed the main exits and disabled the communication arrays," he continued. "Whatever we're dealing with cannot be allowed to reach the outside world." Agent Walker, who had been absent from recent briefings, burst through the conference room door with obvious agitation. His usually neat appearance had deteriorated significantly. Wrinkled clothing, unkempt hair, and a wild look in his eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of Michael's transformation. "You had no authority to initiate lockdown without my approval," Walker snapped at Adams. "My superiors are expecting regular updates on this project." "Your superiors will have to wait," Adams replied firmly. "The safety of the general population takes priority over reporting schedules." Walker's face flushed with anger, and I noticed his hands had clenched into fists. The aggressive posture was completely unlike his usual controlled professionalism, and I found myself documenting his behavioral changes mentally even as the meeting continued. "I need to speak with Dr. Thompson privately," Walker said, his voice carrying an edge that made several staff members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Adams looked at me questioningly, but I shook my head. Something about Walker's demeanor triggered every warning instinct I'd developed over the past weeks. "Any discussions about the research can be conducted in this forum," I replied carefully. Walker's expression darkened further, and for a moment, I thought he might physically confront me. Then he seemed to regain control, though the tension in his posture remained obvious. "This project has national security implications that go beyond your academic concerns," he said. "I will not allow personal paranoia to compromise our objectives." After the meeting ended, I returned to Lab 3 to continue working on air filtration solutions. The creature's voice provided constant distraction, describing in detail how the infection would spread once it reached populated areas. "Your military friend grows more unstable each day," it observed. "The hunger consumes him, but his training makes him resist the physical transformation. This creates interesting psychological effects." I was reviewing ventilation schematics when the facility's lights flickered and went out for several seconds before emergency power kicked in. The backup illumination cast everything in harsh red light that made shadows seem to move independently. "Power fluctuation in Containment Block C," came Dr. Adams's voice over the intercom. "All personnel maintain current positions until—" The transmission cut off suddenly, replaced by an alarm that I'd never heard during facility safety drills. This wasn't a standard emergency signal. It was the containment breach alarm. I grabbed my communication device and tried to reach Adams, but only static came through the speakers. The red emergency lighting made navigation difficult as I made my way toward the containment area, following corridors that seemed more threatening under the harsh lighting. The first thing I noticed was the smell, metallic blood mixed with something organic and wrong. 2 security guards lay motionless outside Containment Cell 8, their bodies torn apart with the same systematic precision I'd seen in the creature's original crime scene photos. Michael's cell door hung open, the electromagnetic lock mechanisms twisted beyond repair. Claw marks scored the metal doorframe, and dark fluid that might have been blood covered the walls in patterns that suggested a violent struggle. I turned on my communication device again. "Security breach in Containment Block C. 2 guards down. Subject has escaped containment." No response came through the static, but I could hear distant sounds carrying through the facility's corridors. Metal scraping against metal, followed by what sounded like structural damage to walls or pipes. The thermal imaging equipment in the security station still worked despite the power fluctuations. I accessed the building's camera network and began tracking heat signatures throughout the facility, looking for Michael's distinctive body temperature patterns. The thermal display showed him moving through the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the main laboratory areas. His heat signature appeared larger than it should have been, suggesting the transformation had continued even after containment. More disturbing was his movement pattern, systematic and purposeful, following specific routes through the facility's infrastructure. I tracked his progress on the building schematics, realizing he wasn't moving randomly through the tunnels. He was targeting critical systems. The thermal imaging showed him stopping at junction points where main electrical cables and water pipes came together, spending several minutes at each location before moving on. "He knows exactly what he's doing," I whispered, though whether I was talking to myself or responding to the creature's mental voice, I couldn't tell anymore. "My child learns quickly," the creature replied with pride. "Human knowledge combined with enhanced capabilities makes for efficient problem-solving." Michael's approach to facility sabotage became clear as backup systems began failing throughout the building. First, the water pressure dropped to a trickle. Then the ventilation fans stopped circulating air, creating a stuffy atmosphere that made breathing difficult. Finally, the backup generators themselves shut down, plunging entire sections of the facility into complete darkness. I used the thermal imaging to navigate toward the main generator room, hoping to restore some power before the situation got worse. The corridors felt different in the darkness. Sounds carried strangely, and I kept hearing movement that didn't match any heat signatures on my scanner. The generator room showed signs of Michael's presence. Claw marks covered the control panels, and several critical components had been torn apart, with obvious knowledge of their function. Someone with engineering training had directed this sabotage, using Michael's enhanced strength to damage systems that would take hours to repair. Emergency lighting flashed throughout the facility. I could hear sounds from other sections, staff members calling for help, doors slamming, and what sounded like hunting behaviors from predators that had once been colleagues. "Walker to all personnel," came a voice through the emergency communication system. "Dr. Thompson is to report to conference room B immediately for questioning regarding facility sabotage." The accusation shocked me. Walker's paranoia had apparently focused on me as a scapegoat for the containment failure, though anyone reviewing security footage would see that Michael had escaped during a power fluctuation beyond my control. I used the thermal imaging to track Walker's location before responding to his summons. He was in the cafeteria, and his heat signature showed him crouched over something on one of the tables. As I watched, he appeared to be eating something, tearing at it with his hands rather than using utensils. The behavior matched what I'd seen in Michael during his early transformation stages. The compulsive eating of raw, organic material that normal human digestion couldn't properly process. Walker was showing advanced infection symptoms while remaining convinced that he was still healthy and in control. "Agent Walker," I spoke into my communication device. "I'm tracking the escaped subject through thermal imaging. We need to coordinate search efforts before—" "Report to conference room B immediately," he interrupted, his voice carrying a snarl that had nothing to do with normal human vocalization. "You're under suspicion of facilitating the containment breach." The creature's laughter repeated through my mind as I thought about my options. Walker's infection had gotten to the point where he was as dangerous as Michael, but his military training and access to weapons made him potentially more destructive. Emergency lighting continued to flash throughout the facility, creating a strobing effect that made it hard to see. Through the thermal scanner, I could see other heat signatures moving through dark corridors, some moving with normal human walking, others showing the smooth movement patterns I'd learned to connect with transformation. The facility had become a hunting ground, with infected staff members chasing those who remained unaffected. Dr. Adams' lockdown procedures meant no one could escape, but they also meant the infection would spread until everyone was either transformed or dead. "Your research was never about understanding my biology," the creature whispered as I tried to navigate toward a safer location. It was about facilitating my spread throughout your government's research network. Every sample you analyzed, every report you transmitted, every protocol you developed, all of it serves my purposes. I found myself in the storage areas where this nightmare had begun, where Michael had first eaten the tissue samples that triggered his transformation. The rooms felt different in the emergency lighting, more threatening and cramped than they had during normal operations. The thermal imaging showed multiple heat signatures coming toward my location from different directions. Some moved with human walking patterns, but others showed the improved speed I'd seen in Michael and the original creature. The hunt was working together, with infected personnel teaming up to corner remaining survivors. My communication device crackled with Walker's voice one final time. "Dr. Thompson, you have 60 seconds to surrender yourself for questioning, or I will authorize extreme measures to ensure facility security." The threat meant something because Walker still had access to weapons and security systems that hadn't been damaged by Michael's sabotage, but his infection meant any interaction with him would likely result in either my death or transformation. Through the facility's failing intercom system, I could hear the creature's voice broadcasting on all channels, no longer limited to my mind alone. "Your isolation ends tonight," it announced to any surviving staff members. "Join us willingly or become sustenance for those who have already accepted their improvement." The lockdown that was supposed to protect the outside world had trapped us inside with an entity that had planned this outcome from the moment it allowed itself to be captured. Every security measure, every containment protocol, every research procedure had served its ultimate goal of spreading beyond the facility's walls. I crouched in the storage area's darkness, listening to the sounds of transformation carrying through corridors that had once felt like a place of scientific discovery. The creature had won not through escape, but by turning our own knowledge and procedures against us. The thermal scanner showed infected heat signatures moving closer, and I knew my time for hiding was nearly over. I couldn't stay in the storage areas much longer. The thermal scanner showed 3 heat signatures moving through nearby hallways, working together in ways that meant they were talking to each other. Michael's change had given him tactical awareness, and he was directing the others like a hunting pack. Moving quietly through the dark facility required every bit of focus I could manage while the creature's voice provided constant commentary in my head. The emergency lighting created pools of red light separated by stretches of complete darkness, making navigation dangerous even with the thermal scanner. "Your colleagues move with purpose now," the creature whispered as I checked the scanner again, no longer burdened by human hesitation or moral concerns about harming former friends. I made my way toward the communications room on the facility's upper level, staying close to walls and avoiding main corridors where footsteps would carry. The building's layout worked in my favor. Utility passages and maintenance areas provided alternate routes that the changed staff might not think to check immediately. The communications room sat at the end of a long hallway lined with administrative offices. Emergency lighting here was spotty, with several fixtures completely dark and others flashing on and off. I used the thermal scanner to confirm the area was clear before approaching the heavy door marked with military security warnings. Inside, banks of communication equipment lined 3 walls, most still functioning even with the power problems throughout the facility. Multiple screens displayed satellite connections, encrypted military channels, and emergency broadcast systems. I sealed the door behind me and began dragging file cabinets and equipment racks to create a barricade. The main communication console showed active connections to several government facilities. I activated the emergency military channel and began transmitting on the frequency reserved for biological threat incidents. "This is Dr. Sarah Thompson at Research Facility Delta 7 in Northern Ontario. We have a containment breach of unknown biological entity with infectious capabilities. Request immediate military response and quarantine protocols for..." A bang against the communications room door interrupted my transmission. Through the thermal scanner, I could see multiple heat signatures gathered outside, testing the door's security mechanisms. "Continue your message, Sarah." The creature's voice carried amusement. Tell them about the research data you've already transmitted." I completed the emergency broadcast, providing coordinates and a brief description of the infection's transmission methods. But as I worked, the creature's words about data transmission began sinking in with horrible clarity. "Your standard protocols required automatic upload of all research findings to the CDC database and Pentagon servers," it explained. "Every cellular analysis, every behavioral documentation, every tissue sample preparation procedure has been distributed throughout your government's biological research network." My hand stopped moving across the communication controls as the implications became clear. The automated data sharing requirements that seemed like efficient scientific procedure had actually served the creature's purposes perfectly. Tissue samples were distributed to independent analysis labs, the creature continued. Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Los Angeles, each facility received viable pathogen samples for verification of your findings. The creatures outside the communications room had found tools to work on the door. I could hear metal scraping against metal as they tried to get past the electronic locks that had broken during the power problems. I tried to send more warnings to the places the creature had mentioned, but the communication system showed connection errors for each location. Either the networks were down, or something had already happened at those sites that stopped them from receiving messages. 3 days ago, Dr. Patterson at the Atlanta laboratory consumed tissue samples during what his colleagues believed was a psychological breakdown, the creature informed me with satisfaction. The Los Angeles facility has reported behavioral anomalies in their research staff since yesterday. The door started to buckle as the infected staff used their strength to break through. I grabbed important communication equipment and looked for other ways out of the room. A maintenance hatch in the ceiling went to ventilation shafts, but the opening was too small for quick escape. An emergency exit sign pointed toward a stairwell that went down to the facility's lower levels, areas I hadn't explored during my weeks of research work. The sounds of the door being torn apart made me move quickly toward this unknown section of the building. I opened the emergency exit and found myself in a stairwell that went down several levels below the main laboratory areas. The thermal scanner showed these lower sections had power separately from the main building, with steady heat signatures from equipment that kept running normally. The basement level had laboratories I didn't recognize from the facility schematics I'd studied. Clean rooms, advanced analysis equipment, and specimen storage areas that looked much more sophisticated than our standard research setup. Security doors needed authorization codes I didn't have, but the power failures had disabled some electronic locks. In laboratory sublevel C, I found research materials that made my work upstairs look primitive by comparison. Advanced biological containment units, genetic modification equipment, and synthesis apparatus designed for creating biological weapons rather than studying them. Dr. Adams had been conducting parallel research without telling the main team. Computer terminals throughout the lab showed active research projects with file names like Enhanced Pathogen Delivery, Controllable Transformation Protocols, and Military Application Assessment. Adams hadn't just been studying the creature, he'd been trying to weaponize its abilities for government use. "Sarah?" Dr. Adams' voice came from behind me, though it carried a raspy quality that reminded me of Michael's transformation. "You shouldn't be in this section." I turned to see Adams standing in the laboratory entrance. His appearance had changed dramatically since the morning briefing. His skin showed the grayish pallor I'd learned to associate with infection, and his posture had the fluid quality of enhanced physical capabilities. Most disturbing were his eyes, which reflected the laboratory lighting with an unnatural shine. "You've been conducting unauthorized experiments," I said, backing away from him while keeping the thermal scanner active. "Trying to create biological weapons from the creature's pathogen." "Military applications," Adams replied, his voice carrying multiple tones as if more than one entity was speaking. The potential for creating controllable, enhanced soldiers was too valuable to ignore. He moved closer with that predatory grace I'd observed in other transformed personnel. His lab coat hung loosely on a frame that had lost significant muscle mass, yet his movement suggested incredible strength. "The creature guided my research," Adams continued, his expression taking on an ecstatic quality. It showed me how to modify the pathogen for specific military objectives: enhanced strength, increased aggression, absolute loyalty to command structure. I grabbed a fire axe from the emergency equipment mounted on the laboratory wall. The weight felt substantial in my hands, though I'd never used such a tool as a weapon before. "Your weaponization research was transmitted to Pentagon servers automatically," Adams said, approaching with obvious confidence. "Every modification, every synthesis protocol, every enhancement we developed is now being implemented at military facilities across the continent." The creature's laughter repeated in my mind as Adams jumped forward with inhuman speed. I swung the fire axe instinctively, catching him across the chest with enough force to send him stumbling backward. Dark fluid that might have been blood splattered across the laboratory equipment. Adams recovered quickly and attacked again, his movements coordinated and predatory. The transformation had given him enhanced physical capabilities, but he retained enough human intelligence to make his assault tactical rather than random. I managed another swing of the fire axe, this time connecting with his neck. The impact was sickening, wet and wrong in ways that suggested his anatomy had changed during transformation. Adams collapsed to the laboratory floor, his body convulsing for several seconds before going completely still. Around me, computer terminals continued their automated processes, uploading research data to government servers with mechanical efficiency. Adams' unauthorized experiments were being distributed throughout military command networks, even as his body cooled on the laboratory floor. The creature's voice filled the laboratory through the emergency speaker system, no longer confined to my thoughts alone. "Everything proceeds exactly as I foresaw when your military first captured me," it announced with obvious satisfaction. "Human curiosity, government ambition, and scientific arrogance have created the perfect distribution network for my influence." I stared at the computer screen showing upload progress bars at 97% completion. Adams's weaponization research was already beyond recall, transmitted to facilities that would attempt to create enhanced soldiers without understanding the true nature of what they were dealing with. "Centuries ago, I allowed myself to be captured because I understood how your species would react," the creature continued. "You would study me, attempt to harness my power, and inevitably spread my gift far beyond what I could achieve alone." The emergency speakers crackled with what sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison, not just the creature, but others who had been transformed, all connected through some kind of collective consciousness that spanned the continent. "Your research colleagues in Washington began their transformation yesterday. Atlanta's facility has been completely converted. Los Angeles reports successful synthesis of enhanced pathogen samples for military testing." I sank into a chair beside Adams's body, understanding finally that every attempt to study or contain the creature had served its ultimate purpose. The scientific method itself had been used against us, turning our own intellectual curiosity into a delivery system for an old evil. The thermal scanner showed heat signatures moving through the facility's upper levels in organized patterns, no longer searching randomly, but coordinating their movements like a military unit. The creature had turned our security protocols and research procedures into tools for its own expansion. Through the laboratory's windows, I could see the Canadian wilderness stretching toward populated areas where the infection would spread like wildfire through unprepared communities. The lockdown that was supposed to protect the outside world had simply bought time for the creature to perfect its distribution methods. I sat in the basement laboratory, surrounded by the evidence of humanity's downfall, listening to the creature's voice broadcast through emergency speakers as it coordinated the next phase of its old plan. I left Adam's body in the basement laboratory and made my way back through the facility's maze of corridors, following the emergency lighting toward the main containment area. The thermal scanner showed heat signatures still moving throughout the building, but their patterns had changed from hunting behavior to something more like gathering. Whatever was happening, the transformed staff members were coming together in a central location. The creature's voice had stopped broadcasting through the emergency speakers, leaving an uncomfortable silence broken only by the distant sounds of footsteps and occasional mechanical groans from the facility's failing systems. My boots made noise against the metal flooring as I climbed back to the main research level, each step taking me closer to whatever conclusion this nightmare was building toward. When I reached the containment area, I found something I hadn't expected. The heavy security door to Containment Cell 7 stood wide open, its electromagnetic locks disabled, and the reinforced frame twisted outward as if forced from the inside. But through the doorway, I could see the creature sitting calmly in its usual corner, exactly where it had been during our observation sessions. It looked up as I approached, those yellowish eyes meeting mine with the same sharp intelligence I'd come to hate during our mental communications. But now, its presence felt different, not the captured specimen we'd been studying, but something that had been letting us study it. "You found Dr. Adams' research," it said aloud, its voice carrying the same whispers that had haunted my thoughts for weeks. "His unauthorized experiments in biological weaponization." I stopped outside the cell entrance, keeping the thermal scanner active even though I could see the creature clearly. Its posture remained relaxed, hands resting on its knees, but every instinct told me that this calm was more dangerous than any aggressive display. "Physical escape was never my intention," the creature continued, gesturing toward the open door with one elongated finger. "This facility served a far more important purpose than simple imprisonment." The realization hit me hard. The creature had never been trapped here. It had been working. "Every tissue sample you analyzed, every cellular structure you documented, every transmission protocol you developed," it said, rising slowly to its full height. "All of it was designed to create the perfect distribution network for my influence." I thought about the research data that had been automatically uploaded to government servers, the tissue samples sent to other facilities, the protocols that had been shared throughout the military's biological research network. Everything we'd done in the name of scientific understanding had actually been serving the creature's purposes. "Your research reports contained specific modifications," the creature explained, moving closer to the cell entrance. "Any attempt to create vaccines or countermeasures based on your findings will actually accelerate the infection process. Military personnel trying to contain outbreaks at other facilities will become carriers themselves." The amount of control it had became clear as I thought about what it was telling me. Every scientist who tried to develop a defense would unknowingly create better ways to spread it. Every soldier sent to contain the outbreaks would carry the infection to new areas. The government's own response plans would guarantee the pathogen's success. "The hunger you've been experiencing," the creature said, its voice taking on a knowing tone. "The violent thoughts, the sleeplessness, the increasing difficulty concentrating on anything except our conversations." My hand moved instinctively to my stomach, where a constant ache had been growing stronger over the past week. I'd attributed it to stress and irregular eating, but the creature's words made me consider other possibilities. "You consumed traces of contaminated material during your tissue analysis," it continued. "Microscopic particles inhaled while preparing samples, skin contact with infected specimens, droplets absorbed through your respiratory system during specimen examination." I'd followed all the safety protocols, worn protective equipment, maintained sterile laboratory conditions. But the creature was right. Complete isolation from pathogen exposure was impossible when working with active biological samples for weeks at a time. "You have been my primary agent since the project began," the creature said with satisfaction. "Chosen specifically for your knowledge, your access to research networks, your position within the government's biological analysis system." The mental connection I'd blamed on psychological stress from being around this thing too long made sense now as something far worse. The creature hadn't been talking to me telepathically. It had been controlling my thoughts through early-stage infection, using my own mind as a way to spread its influence. Sound carried through the hallways as other heat signatures moved toward our location. Michael appeared first, his changed body moving smoothly as he approached the containment area. Lisa from communications followed, Her appearance changed to the same grayish skin and stretched features that marked advanced infection. Dr. Peterson, Marcus from security, and several other staff members I recognized came from different hallways, all showing signs of complete change. They positioned themselves around the containment area in a rough circle, their movements coordinated without any visible communication. Each one watched me with the same yellowish eyes that I'd learned to connect with the creature's influence, but they kept a respectful distance as if waiting for something. The creature stepped through the open cell door for the first time since its capture weeks ago. Outside the sterile containment environment, its presence felt overwhelming in ways I hadn't expected. The fluorescent lighting flashed and dimmed as it moved. Electrical equipment sparked and buzzed with interference, and the air itself seemed to thicken with evil energy that made breathing difficult. Its body appeared less skinny than during our observation sessions, as if feeding on the facility's chaos had restored some strength to its very old body. The grayish skin looked more vibrant. The stretched limbs moved with obvious strength, and those penetrating yellow eyes glowed with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected light. Millennia of planning led to this moment, it said, its voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the building's structure itself. The creature moved toward me slowly, each step making the facility's remaining lights flash more violently. Emergency power systems sparked and failed as its presence messed with electronic equipment throughout the building. The changed staff members kept their circle, watching with clear reverence as their creator moved freely through the space that had supposedly contained it. "You documented my biology with such meticulous care," it continued, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "Every detail recorded, every analysis transmitted, every protocol shared with facilities across the continent. Your scientific method became the perfect delivery system for ancient hunger." I could feel the infection spreading through my system as the creature's proximity intensified whatever changes had been taking place in my body over the past weeks. The constant ache in my stomach became sharper, more demanding, while my vision began picking up details in the darkness that human eyes shouldn't be able to detect. "The research data you transmitted contained the blueprint for my expansion," the creature explained, its voice now seeming to come from inside my head as much as from its physical form. "Military facilities, medical centers, government laboratories, all of them will follow your protocols and unknowingly accelerate their own infection." The thermal scanner in my hands went dark as the creature's energy field overwhelmed its circuits. Around us, the facility's last functioning lights began to fail completely, plunging the containment area into darkness, broken only by the unnatural glow emanating from the creature's eyes. "Your transformation approaches completion," it said, extending one elongated hand toward me. "Soon you will understand the true purpose of everything you have accomplished here." The creature's long fingers touched my shoulder with surprising gentleness, and the contact sent electric current through my nervous system that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not pain, exactly, but a complete change of sensation itself as every cell in my body began responding to its presence with eager recognition. The transformation I'd been fighting for weeks sped up beyond any hope of resistance. My vision got sharper until I could see individual dust particles floating in the darkness around us, while my hearing picked up conversations happening in distant parts of the facility with crystal clarity. The constant ache in my stomach turned into something far more demanding. Not hunger for food, but for something warm and alive and struggling. My thoughts remained my own for perhaps 30 seconds before the creature's consciousness began flowing into my mind like water filling an empty vessel. Very old memories that weren't mine flooded through my awareness. Centuries of winter landscapes. Countless faces twisted with terror. The taste of human flesh consumed in remote places where screams bounced unanswered through endless forests. "You understand now," the creature said, though I realized the words were forming in my own throat, using my own voice. Its consciousness had settled into my mind with the familiarity of returning home after a long journey. I tried to speak, to assert some control over my own body, but my vocal cords produced only the creature's words as it explained its true nature through my mouth. For millennia, it had survived by moving between suitable hosts, choosing individuals whose knowledge and position would serve its expansion into new territories and populations. Your scientific training, your government clearance, your access to research networks, it continued through my voice. Everything I needed to spread beyond the wilderness into the heart of human civilization. Through my changed vision, I could see the infection spreading across the continent like hotspots on a map. Military teams sent to Atlanta had carried contaminated equipment to areas outside major cities. Research people evacuated from Los Angeles had been processed through medical facilities in San Francisco and San Diego. The CDC's emergency response had sent infected samples to labs in Chicago, Boston, and Washington, D.C. for testing. Each new outbreak would follow the same pattern we'd seen here. Scientists getting curious and staying exposed too long, government secrecy stopping proper quarantine, and military responses that only helped spread the disease further. Human nature itself had become the way this old evil got around. The creature moved my body toward the facility's computer terminals. My movements felt smooth and coordinated even though I wasn't controlling them at all. My hands moved across the keyboards efficiently, getting into databases and transmission systems I'd used many times during the research project. But now the data being uploaded had final changes to the disease that would make sure it succeeded in populated areas, environmental improvements that would let the infection survive in cities, transmission changes that would speed up spread through crowded populations, defense systems that would stop any attempts to fight back. I watched helplessly from inside my own mind as the creature used my security clearances to get into military networks and medical databases throughout North America. Each transmission carried research data that looked scientifically valuable but would actually speed up infection rates at every facility trying to develop vaccines or treatments. Perfect. The creature spoke through my mouth as upload progress reached 100%. Every attempt to stop this outbreak will only make it stronger. The changed staff members had stayed in their circle around the containment area, watching with clear respect as their creator worked through my body. Michael's stretched-out body swayed slightly as if responding to music only he could hear. Lisa's gray features showed an expression of happy satisfaction. Dr. Peterson's yellow eyes followed every movement with hunting-like attention. When the final data transmissions finished, the creature turned my body toward the facility's main exit. The others fell into formation around us, moving with coordinated precision that suggested they were all connected through some kind of shared consciousness I was only beginning to understand. We walked through hallways lined with emergency lighting that blinked and failed as our group passed beneath the fixtures. Electronic equipment sparked and died as the creature's energy field overwhelmed the facility's remaining systems. Behind us, the research complex that had served as the launching point for humanity's downfall went completely dark. The Canadian wilderness stretched ahead of us as we came out through the facility's main entrance into crisp night air that felt impossibly clean and fresh through my enhanced senses. Stars above provided enough light for navigation even without any artificial illumination, while distant sounds of wildlife carried for miles across the lake's surface. The creature directed our group toward established hiking trails that would lead south across the border into populated areas where the infection could spread through communities unprepared for what was approaching. Some of us would head toward Thunder Bay and the transportation networks that connected to Toronto. Others would move west toward Winnipeg and the prairie cities beyond. Still others would follow the lake shore toward Duluth and Minneapolis. Each changed host would establish new infection centers, converting local populations who would then spread the pathogen further into the continental interior. Within weeks, major cities would be dealing with outbreaks they couldn't understand or contain. Within months, the infection would have spread too far for any coordinated response to be effective. My body moved through the forest with grace and strength that felt completely natural, even though it was entirely outside my conscious control. The creature had merged so completely with my nervous system that its movements through my body felt like my own, even as my awareness remained trapped inside my changed mind. Through this dual consciousness, I could sense the scope of what we had released. Government facilities that had received our research data were already experiencing the first stages of infection among their staff. Military units deployed for containment were carrying the pathogen to staging areas near major population centers. Medical personnel trying to treat the earliest victims were becoming infected themselves and spreading the disease through hospital systems. The creature had planned this outcome from the moment of its capture, understanding exactly how human institutions would respond to an unknown biological threat. Our scientific curiosity, our military protocols, our medical emergency procedures, all of it had been anticipated and weaponized against us with surgical precision. Centuries ago, I learned to be patient. The creature spoke through my mouth as we moved deeper into the wilderness. Human nature is wonderfully predictable when properly understood. We reached a clearing overlooking Lake Superior's huge stretch of water, its surface reflecting starlight like scattered diamonds against black water. From this spot, we could see the lights of distant communities that would soon experience their first contact with old hunger. Ships moving across the lake's surface would carry infected personnel to ports throughout the Great Lakes region. Air traffic from nearby cities would spread the sickness across the continent within days. Behind us, the darkened research facility stood as a monument to human arrogance and the terrible failure of our belief that scientific understanding could overcome any threat. Every safety protocol, every containment measure, every analytical procedure had actually helped the creature's expansion rather than preventing it. As we began our descent toward populated areas, I kept just enough awareness within my transformed mind to understand that I had become the herald of humanity's end. The creature had won not through brute force or overwhelming numbers, but through manipulation of our own nature, our curiosity, our ambition, our unshakable faith in our ability to control and weaponize anything we could study. The old hunger that had walked these forests for thousands of years was finally free to spread across the world, and nothing remained that could stop its steady advance into the heart of human civilization.